The ACC's grant of rights is binding, and all 15 teams are bound to that conference through 2036. Or are they? Well, today I'm bringing on a guest, and we're going to talk about just that. So pull up a chair, sit back, relax, and let's talk about it. What is up, college sports fans, Big 12 fans, and fellow members of Mountaineer Nation? This is Couz. Welcome into another edition of Couz's Corner. So pull that chair up, and let me serve you up another shot of top shelf college football content. On tap today, we are talking about the ACC. Could they lose teams? Could the conference actually dissolve? And is that grant of rights as binding as we think? And to bring the guest I'm bringing on today is going to talk about this. He has studied this at length, and he's going to present his findings here to you today on Couz's Corner, and it's none other than TJ from Double Fries No Slaw Pod. How you doing, TJ?
Man, I'm good, Couz. How you doing, buddy? Thanks for having me.
I'm doing great, man.
I feel like there's no off season in what we do, man.
I know.
It's kind of 100% of the time wide open.
Sometimes it's busier.
Yeah, for real. At least during the week season, you know what's coming each week. Stuff can get crazy in the off season,
right.
Recruiting and the portal and conference realignment and everything else.
It is. But everybody go check TJ out at Double Fries Pod on YouTube. He covers Florida State football, and he also, I'm assuming, on podcast platforms as well. Is that correct, TJ?
Yeah.
Okay, and also on Twitter at Double Fries Pod. But it's Double Fries No Slaw is the full name of his podcast.
It just didn't fit in the Twitter handle.
Right, that's right.
I would have done the whole thing, but it didn't fit.
That'd be a large Twitter handle.
That'd be big. I need Elon to give me one of those.
There you go. Man, I came across actually with two videos you've done. One you just did a day or two ago about Florida State Clemson possibly leaving the ACC. And that led me to a video you did about a month or so ago where you laid out in detail how the ACC could potentially dissolve and why this grant of rights may not be as binding as we think and how the numbers actually work for some of these teams to get out and not lose any money. So I'm going to pop up on the screen the PowerPoint slide that you used in your presentation and let you kind of talk through this, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So you're right. You know, there's a couple of thoughts, and I'll kind of maybe start backwards and then we'll get into this. But as you can see up there, the buyout for any one team to leave would be $120 million. And then the ACC owns your media rights through 2036. And there are different projections on that. I know that's a huge number, from 300 million to 600 million. It's somewhere in the middle of that, right? Like that's the kind of the best estimates based on contracts, signings, the number of years between now and 2036. So that number is about what's owed. And so if a team was to leave the ACC right now, Florida State, we'll say, for example, they would be on the hook for roughly that amount. And if you look at the next slide, that's exactly what we kind of are able to come up with. For a team to leave the ACC, you're going to have to pay that buyout, which that 120, it's a lot of money for me and you. For a team, I've spoken with people at Florida State, they're not worried about that 120 million. They'd pay that. I don't want to put words in their mouth. They'd pay that tomorrow. Right. It's the 400 to 700 million that you're kind of on the hook for on the back end with the media rights based on the ACC owning those rights. So that presents a problem. Right now, most teams could not be on the hook for $500 million to almost $750 million. And that's where I think you almost would need to be creative to get out of the ACC. In yesterday's video, we talked a little bit about how some different options exist. One option that we'll talk about today is the ACC dissolving. An option that also exists is maybe going to court and challenging that contract, trying to see if you could get out of it that way. That could also be a pretty costly legal battle as well. And then you may lose that. If you lose that court battle, you probably lose voting rights while you're in the ACC for the rest of the time. And then the third option would be to settle with the ACC. I also don't think that that's really feasible. The ACC is the one that owns the contract. I don't think they're going to just give things up, but they did with Maryland back in the day. So I suppose that's possible. But the option that we'll talk about today is, well, that $720 million to get out, or $420 to $720, could you dissolve the ACC? Could you get out of the ACC by dissolving it and not have to pay any of that money? So that's what we'll talk about today.
Okay.
This is from Andy Staples from The Athletic. There's a chance that the league dissolves, and the grant of rights would dissolve with it. For the ACC to dissolve, it's very simple. A simple majority of the members would have to leave. So you mentioned there are 15 teams. Notre Dame is not counted in this for this grant of rights. So 15 teams, you need a simple majority. That would be 8. It's actually a good thing. We get a lot of comments asking about Notre Dame with this. It's a good thing for Florida State and any team that wants to leave the ACC that Notre Dame is not involved in this, because then you would need 9 teams to get to that simple majority. And I don't think Notre Dame would vote with Florida State, Clemson, other teams that would want to get out. Notre Dame's got a really sweet deal right now, getting to be independent in football and be in the ACC. So I think it's good that Notre Dame's not part of it. The Athletic, Andy Staples is reporting. I linked this in the video, which I can get you the link to this article as well. A simple majority would get you out of the conference. It would dissolve the conference.
And I will leave a link to the whole video that TJ did in my description box, by the way, so you guys can check it out. But that was interesting about Notre Dame, because that's actually one of the questions I came away with after I watched your video. Was, does that include Notre Dame? Because in my mind, I'm thinking, well, if Notre Dame wants to go to the Big Ten, then they might join into this, in with Florida State and Clemson in that battle. But you're saying they're not included.
They're not. No, they're not going to be part of anything that's discussed with leaving, going. So essentially, the plot or the thought of how this would work, and we'll break down these numbers in just a moment, but we'll throw them up on the screen so you guys can think about them, look at them. We'll talk about it in just a second. But the thought of how this would work is you'd have 4 teams. My 4 teams that I think it would be the 4 ADs that have come out and said they need unequal revenue sharing in the ACC. Unequal revenue sharing is great if you're a top dog. It's not good if you're, I don't mean to call teams out, but Syracuse, Boston College, teams at the bottom of the conference, Duke in football, things like that. So unequal revenue sharing, Florida State's, Clemson's, Miami's, and North Carolina's ADs have come out in favor of that. I believe those 4 teams would vote to leave the conference. And so the premise is you take those 4 teams and you formulate a group. And this wouldn't be their ADs saying, I know people talk about collusion and, oh, you're not allowed to do this. This is not legal. This would be representatives, just kind of like NIL, like almost like a collective group that maybe is tied to the university, but has the culpability. The university's not going to get in trouble. They would formulate a pact with 4 other teams. It'd be a first come, first served basis of 8 teams that reached agreements with other conferences. For example, let's say Florida State, Clemson end up in the SEC. Let's say UNC and Miami end up in the Big Ten. You need 4 other teams to go elsewhere. For all intent and purposes, let's say that 4 other teams end up in the Big 12, because this is a Big 12 show.
Right.
That would create a revenue gap. Florida State, Clemson, Miami, and UNC would make more money immediately, but teams going to the Big 12 would immediately make less money. If you look at what the difference is, the Big 12 would pay a little bit better in 2023. They pay a little bit better in 2024. 2025 is the same, but then all of a sudden the ACC, those 4 teams that left would have made more money by staying in the ACC, and you do get a revenue gap. And now this is based on the numbers that are projected out through 2036 when the grant of rights is done. But you can kind of see there on the screen right now it's pretty close, but the ACC's deal is actually a little bit sweeter there in the Big 12 than the Big 12's there in the 2030s, the late 2020s. I will say this. I think all of this would change. I think that by getting new teams, the Big 12 would renegotiate a media rights deal, and this number would come down even more. But essentially, based on today's numbers, a team leaving the ACC and going to the Big 12 in 2023 would have a net loss of about $60 million, right? It would cost, let's say, NC State $60 million to go from the ACC to the Big 12. Well, NC State's not going to agree to that. There's no way in the world that they would agree to lose that money, right? $60 million over the next 13, 14 years. So what I believe should happen is those 4 teams that are making more money should essentially foot that bill. And if each one of them took care of one, you basically, Florida State would be on the hook for $60 million. North Carolina would be on the hook for $60 million. Clemson would be on the hook for $60 million. Miami would be on the hook for $60 million, because they need to make up that revenue gap difference that the other 4 teams that are leaving the ACC would have made anyway. So would Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina, Miami agree to that? Would they agree to that paying $60 million? Would they agree to being on that hook? I believe they would. And our next slide shows us why. The difference in money that Florida State would make by going to the ACC is astronomical. Over the 14 years, the numbers add up there. Over the 14 years, Florida State would make $600 million more by being in the SEC as opposed to the ACC. The Big Ten numbers are even more stark than this. It's about $700 million more. We went with the SEC to prove a point, just to be a little bit lower. Also, a lot of people think that Florida State ends up in the SEC. But Florida State, by going to the SEC, would make an additional $600 million. If I offered Florida State $600 million and said, but guys, it's going to cost you $60 million to pay for one of these other teams that had to go to the Big 12 that didn't have as good of a media rights deal, would you take it? Florida State's AD would take that money in a heartbeat. So would Miami's. So would North Carolina's. So would Clemson's. These numbers. Sorry, go ahead.
It's astronomical. I mean, you're still banking $540 million.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, these numbers are very conservative. If Florida State and Clemson were to go to the SEC and the ACC was to be dissolved, the SEC's money is going to go up. This $600 million is a low ball based on what's happening today. If the SEC added 2 premier top 10 programs, that money's going up. And if the Big 12 added teams like NC State, UVA, Pittsburgh, Virginia Tech, the Big 12's money's going up too. So it'd be even less of a gap, right? The Big 12's money would be closer to what the ACC. Florida State would probably be on the hook for about $35 million, and they'd probably make about $750 million. But we went with what today's numbers are to just kind of illustrate the point. It'd probably be even less of a detriment than this, right? And so I think this is the way you do it. You dissolve the conference. You take care of 4 other teams. I think it's the first 4 teams that can show they have an agreement ready with another conference, whether that be the American, whether that be the Big 12, whether that be the Pac-12, whatever the situation. Or if you get 6 teams in the SEC and Big 10, say they take 3 and 3 each. Well, then you're really just on the hook. 6 teams are splitting the cost of 2 teams being in, let's call it the Big 12.
Right.
Well, at that point, you've got 6 teams splitting $120 million that's on the hook. You're talking about $20 million a team. That is nothing. That is literally nothing. So to me, this is what makes the most sense. You take 4 teams that you believe will be in the SEC and the Big 10. If it wasn't for the media rights buyouts and the conference leaving buyouts, you get 4 teams to the other conferences, and you essentially work to help them out. You can also do other things like playing home and homes with them. You could play 2-for-1 home and homes. I don't know that Florida State's just going to cut North Carolina State a check, but I do think there are ways you could do this. Maybe you play 2 games at NC State, 1 game in Tallahassee, and that revenue that's generated from that game happening there is super helpful. I think there's a lot of really creative ways that you can do this. And I think that Florida State and Clemson are going to leave the ACC one way or the other. I don't think anyone doubts that. And so people have said, well, you would have to, NC State wouldn't agree to this because you'd have to pay them more than what they're currently going to be getting in the ACC in 2030. Let me tell you something. 2032, there's not going to be an ACC. Whether it's because Florida State ponied up the $700 million to leave, whether it's because something like this happened, whether it's like something in the legal system happened, there will be no ACC. So in my opinion, it'd be better for NC State to take this break-even deal than to be left out in the cold in 5 or 6 years when we get to 2029, 2030. Because what I've been told is that Florida State doesn't think it's worth it right now to what did we just tell you? It was about $600 million that Florida State would make by being in the SEC over the ACC. Well, the first slide told you at the beginning that they were going to be on the hook for $500 to $700 million. Well, that's break even. There's no reason to do it just yet. But as we get closer to that 2036 deadline, the number comes down on what the ACC, and the number goes up on what the SEC makes. So eventually there is going to be a break-even point where Florida State says, okay, it's now worth it. Is that in 3 years? Is that in 4 years? Don't know. But there will eventually be a break-even point. And what I've been told is that Florida State will eventually be gone, and so will Clemson and some of these other teams. But teams like NC State, teams like Virginia Tech, teams like Pittsburgh could save them. And when that happens, when Clemson and Florida State are gone, the conference is done. ESPN's not continuing to pay this kind of money. The media rights deal is not going to stay in place. So teams like Pittsburgh, Virginia Tech, NC State, teams like that probably need to get it moving quicker rather than waiting, because there will be no ACC in 2036.
Because there's an argument out there, and several people have made this argument, and I think there's some legitimacy to it, that a lot of these schools, these decisions are made by school presidents, not by athletic directors, not by coaches, not by fans, right? And they're looking at this from an academic perspective. And we all know the ACC is a very strong academic conference. One of the top three, along with the Big Ten and the ACC, the Pac-12. They put academics at a really high standard. Well, would some of those school presidents, like an NC State or some of these other schools, UVA especially, they're one of the highest ranked in the country, would they be willing to join a conference like the Big 12? I'm not sure that they even would.
I just don't know what their options would be, outside of that. And that's where I think it comes in. You've got your top four, right? Your Florida State, North Carolina, Miami, and Clemson, your big brands, they're going to go. And so if UVA can't kind of read the writing on the wall of what's going to happen, and they choose to let Virginia Tech go in their place, and NC State can't read the writing on the wall as to what's going to happen, and they let Pittsburgh go in their place, and I could come up with two more examples, but I think you get the train of thought there. Then that's fine. Let that North Carolina, Virginia belt be there. Let Syracuse go. Let Boston College go. I think Wake Forest would maybe be in a similar boat as UVA, but I think that's why it's the first four teams that can show that they're willing to leave and have a potential deal in place with another conference. And so, yeah, I think there would be some teams that showed a hesitancy to leave, and I think those teams end up getting left. But I know there are four more. I know Pittsburgh would go. I know Louisville would go. I think Virginia Tech would go. I don't think it'd be super hard to convince Syracuse to go. And then, like you said, you mentioned the Pac-12 being a really, really good academic league too. The Pac-12 wants to save it if they can. I don't know if they will, but picking up schools like Virginia and some of these powerhouses academically on the East Coast is probably pretty smart. So I'm with you. I think some of them would kind of snoot their noses up at the idea of being out of that. But like I said, I think, if your option is, man, we're not going to do this because we're staying in the ACC for its academics. Again, I don't think the ACC exists in 10 years. So right. I don't know if that's the smartest play, but I think it is a legitimate question for sure.
Yeah, I could see some of them doing kind of like you're talking about the Pac-12 doing right now. Some of the schools where they're almost willing to take, a crappy deal just to stay together because they don't want to be in the same conference with schools that are below them on an academic level.
Absolutely.
But now if the Pac-12 is able to survive, I could very well see schools like a Virginia, like you mentioned, or a Wake Forest, or a Duke, maybe joining the Pac-12 or merging with them somehow, and then the schools like Louisville and maybe some other ones coming over to the Big 12 because at that point, like you said, they may have no choice.
Doesn't Louisville and Pittsburgh and Virginia Tech, don't those just feel like Big 12? I mean, it was the Big East, right, for a while. So, I mean, they just feel like that's kind of the vibe there. I could certainly see those three schools fitting in. And then you pick up one more. You pick up a Syracuse or a Virginia. I think Virginia would fit fine. I know academically they want a little bit more, but again, you beggars can't be choosers here with how this is going to all kind of go down. So, yeah, I think that'd be interesting for sure.
Yeah, I think if I had my preference as a West Virginia fan, it would definitely be Virginia Tech, Pitt, Louisville, because we'd get three of our rivals back. And then I'd throw NC State in there. I think NC State would be a great addition.
I think they'd be fantastic. They kind of fit that mold, a team that is serious about football. They are serious about a lot of sports, but they've had some success in football. I don't know that anybody ever really expected NC State to go out and compete for national championships, but, an above average football team that takes it very, very – I think they'd fit great in in the Big 12. I don't think NC State fits super well in the Big 10 or the SEC, just to be very frank. But I think they'd be a really good Big 12 team. So, that might be your four right there: Louisville, Pittsburgh, Virginia Tech, and NC State, and that makes it really easy. And then if you need to, you can go to a couple, maybe schools that are outside of that, like Boston College or Syracuse. I mean, I know those aren't the sexiest picks, but you may have to do something to get kind of creative there.
Yeah. And just to reiterate to all the Big 12 folks listening and watching, he mentioned that this is the current numbers. This is not the new deal that the Big 12 just signed. This is their current deal. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. If you go back a slide, I would anticipate that these numbers go up.
Right.
I think that the Big 12 numbers would certainly be higher. Thus, the ACC teams that we have mentioned that may be going to the supposed bigger conferences may very well they'd be on the hook for less than what they are right now. And so I think that'd be pretty interesting to see. I think you'd be able to see the Big 12 be able to. I know they just signed something, but I think you could get the Big 12 to even increase what they're getting if they're able to add some more teams and they have some more teams kind of going to the top of what they've got going. I think the Big 12's revenue would certainly go up if they added 4 pretty premier teams. I think Virginia Tech, Pittsburgh, North Carolina State getting in some of those markets. Louisville definitely takes football very, very seriously. I think that'd be big for them.
Yeah, I just think I think 2030, 2031 to me is the year or the time frame when we'll start seeing a lot of these next dominoes fall.
Yeah.
Obviously, there'll probably be something happen here with the Pac-12, whether they add a couple teams or whatever, San Diego State, whatever. But then I think the next big wave will be 2030, 2031, when you start seeing all these new TV deals start to expire, right?
Yeah.
I think that's when you'll see the next wave, and that's when, to me, if something like this is to happen, that's probably when it'll happen, or at least – now it may start happening before that, but that's when everything will probably start actually falling into place is around that time frame. Just totally my opinion there, but that's kind of how I see it unfolding. Yeah,
it's interesting to look at because I'm with you. Like I really have no idea. Somebody asked me the other day, do you think it'll be, what kind of timeline would you put on things? And my best guess is that Florida State, because so they were asking from an FSU perspective. My best guess would say that Florida State's, they asked me, would Florida State be in the ACC in 2029, right? So 5+ years from now, would they be? And I said, you know what? My gut says no. My gut says by 2028, 2029. But that's kind of right in line with what you're saying right there, 2030, right around that time frame. Because again, I just think that they're, your rights and how much Florida, the ACC has you on the hook for, it goes down every year. And so I think right now, we talked about that $420 to $720 million number. Well, if you cut that in half, right, and you said, okay, well, let's get to 2029. That's about halfway through this thing. Then if you're on the hook for about 240 to 440, does it end up being a lot more like 370? Probably ends up being a lot more palatable then, right? You're not having to forfeit so much money there. I think if Florida State could pay $200 million right now to get out of the ACC scotch-free, I think they'd do it. And I think by the time you get to 2029, I think that's around where the number is going to be. And so, I think that's probably, the time frame that I look at. Now, if it's challenged in court, if something like this proposal was to happen, I know, let me tell you something. I don't know everybody, but I know that some folks have seen this at Florida State and at different colleges. And so I'm not telling you that this is about to be what happens or anything like that, but I know that it's been seen. And so anyway, something to just kind of keep an eye out for and keep a lookout for sure.
Yeah. Well, I know you were wanting this information out there based on the comment you made during your video. So I thought, you know what, I'll let him introduce this to maybe there's a few people out there on the Big 12 side of things who have yet to see this and who may be able to help spread the word, so to speak, of this idea and maybe help get this rolling.
Yeah, I think this would be good for the teams in the ACC. I think this would be really good for the Big 12 for them to pick up 3 or 4 quality football teams that add to what the Big 12 is doing. So yeah, I definitely think that, if you're a Big 12 fan, if you're just a fan of college football in general, I think this is where things are moving. And so I think, getting this message out I love you guys to share what Couz is doing here. Go check out our video for a breakdown of it as well. You kind of got the light. Actually, you got maybe a little bit more in-depth version now that I am a month into talking about it than you got, but you can get the original or on my page. But yeah, I think this is something we should be talking about. This is something that, bring up to the people you chat football with and share Couz's video here. This is important stuff. And it does help both of our conferences tremendously. Well, not my conference anymore, but our new one for sure.
I hear you. So real quick before I let you go, I had another Florida State podcaster on my show a few weeks back or a few months back at this point. And he thinks that Florida State's more likely to go to the Big Ten versus SEC. Do you have that same opinion or no?
No, I've always thought SEC. I know that some people really connected do think Big Ten for Florida State. I still think SEC. I just think it fits more of the team that they're looking for. There are different arguments brought up about the academics at Florida State and how that's kind of rising. They are a top 20 institute in the country. They want to be a research institute and stuff like that. I know that that's really important. The money is also more in the Big Ten. But I think the SEC is going to probably pony up a little bit more to try and keep the Big Ten out of Florida as much as they can. I do think they may end up settling with Miami, but I think they'll want to keep that natural rivalry with SEC program. Florida, I think that my vibe would be SEC, but I guess anything could happen. But what I've heard, what people have said to me has been more of the SEC vibe. And I think Florida State certainly fits more of an SEC school than a Big Ten. If folks are familiar with FSU at all, I think they'd agree with that.
Yeah, I do. What little I know about them, I think the culture fits well.
It's almost identical, man. They've always been an SEC school playing in the ACC, and so I think, and Clemson too. I think Clemson's very much the same way. Whereas Miami feels like a Big Ten school, private university, smaller. I think that fits more there, and so does UNC. So yeah, that's always been the vibe that I've gotten, but we'll see. Fits aren't everything, and I would never say that USC felt like a Big Ten school either. So I guess anything can happen for sure.
Yeah, and who would have thought, 10 years ago, West Virginia ended up in the Big 12, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Holy cow. It's crazy world of college athletics, man.
Yeah, no doubt.
Well, TJ, man, thank you so much. There's no way I could have presented this as well as you because, like I said, you were the man with the plan, as they say, with the numbers and have done the research. So might as well let you come on and give the information yourself instead of me trying to butcher it. But I appreciate you doing that. Everybody go check out TJ's work over at Double Fries No Slaw on YouTube. And he's also on Twitter at Double Fries Pod. Anywhere else that they can find you at?
Those are the big ones. My handle's right under TJ_Pittenger. I love taking questions on this. I love chatting about this. I think that this is all fascinating. So I'll try and check the comments on this video once it comes out to try and interact a little bit there because I really do enjoy talking about this subject. So it is really neat.
Yeah, as do I. So, and I think majority of my listeners do as well. So, well. With that being said, TJ, once again, thank you, man, for coming on, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again sometime.
Yeah, anytime, man. I appreciate you, Couz.
You have a good one.
Thanks, buddy.